So I'm going to be talking about open source software today. Just to give you a kind of brief agenda, I'm going to dive into what is open source software, go over some enterprise implications, generally how we see a shifting landscape in regards to open source software, go over a few advantages and potential risks, and then best practice business recommendations for adopting open source software in an enterprise setting. So firstly, what is open source software? Interestingly enough, this is actually a pretty contested definition within the tech industry. I'm going to defer to the Open Source Initiative. It's actually celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, so it's kind of the true kind of historical standard for what open source is. So they define open source as a freely available in-source code, and that source code can be modified or redistributed without additional permission. So throughout the remainder of my presentation, that's how I've looked at open source software. And just, if you look back to 10, 20 years ago, there's been a huge shift in just the availability of open source software and generally how people are using it, both in an enterprise setting and in more of a tech setting. And I think that can be attributed to two kind of overarching just shifts in general. The first is the internet. Obviously, that has a huge role to play in why open source software has gotten to where it is today. The availability of computing power, the accessibility of the internet. And then I think there's a big shift in perception. I think especially our generation, the sharing economy, people are more collaborative in nature, and there's maybe been a shift to accepting code that's been worked on by someone else and using that in your own organization. So it's generally just the landscape. You can see here that enterprises are investing in open source software. A recent poll from 2017 is showing that 47% of decision makers at small and medium-sized firms as well as large corporations say that open source is either a high or critical priority for developing their IT infrastructure and their software in general. And we can see in a 5-year span, 2010 to 2015, this is for, again, a similar survey run by Black Duck Software, which is one of the big players in the open source space. In 2010, 42% of respondents said they were using open source in their operations. In a 5-year period, that's jumped up to 78%. So this really is, growing extremely fast, and there are a lot of, traditional enterprises and even smaller firms that are just not quite sure how to capture the value that's being generated from open source. One thing I do want to make clear is, open source, I think, tends to be talked about in IT circles, software developers. I'm going to say that open source benefits people across the firm. So this is not an IT decision. This is really, a corporate decision. 90%, just to give you another statistic, 90% of respondents from the same survey I just referred to say that it improves efficiency, interoperability, and innovation. And that interoperability piece is interesting, something that it's hard to grapple with, but how does open source layer on top of old school legacy software is a common challenge in building it into an enterprise environment. So the 3 key factors I want to touch on today that are driving this transformation and will continue to drive it in probably even faster levels are speed. So this is a little bit obvious, but if you think about it, if I'm able to acquire open source software today and I'm starting up a company, that's going to give me a much faster time to market. This is probably more common in smaller firms that are just getting off the ground, but can also be used in a large corporate environment. Innovation, at the end of the day, open source software is somewhat of crowdsourcing. There's millions and millions of developers out there who are super passionate about what they're working on, want to contribute to society in general, and just being able to take advantage of all of their contributions to code is a really awesome opportunity for a lot of corporations to build on. And then the cost piece, another kind of common not misconception, but people automatically think open source software is free. Well, it is free. There are a lot of other costs that come along with it. I'm going to touch on some of these in a minute, but obviously you have to maintain the software. There are managerial costs that come along with implementing it, using it, and tailoring it to your organization. So while there are clear advantages, there are several risks that need to be highlighted when thinking about shifting into an open source environment or pulling in certain aspects of open source. So going back to this dependency piece, it does require constant upkeep, maintenance. You need to have developers of your own, making sure it fits in nicely with your organization structure, potentially building and reusing that code. So that is one piece that is an obvious concern. You can't just download it and never touch it for years to come. The security piece, there's a lot of debate regarding the security of open source software. Some people will tell you that because you have millions of people looking at it, improving it, it may be more secure. I think looking at a larger enterprise environment, there are certain security risks that do need to be taken into account, including IP, legal implications. So that is definitely something that corporations need to be aware of prior to adopting open source. And then the governance piece. This is actually kind of less technical, but I think very, very imperative to having a successful open source network. And this is establishing clear-cut rules and regulations on what people can do, what people can't do, how open source is going to be used to further the organization's goals. With that, I want to hop into some kind of best practice recommendations for CIOs, small corporations, as to what they need to be aware of prior to adopting. So the first piece is security must come first. You can see this kind of crazy honeycomb hexagon. And really, the point I want to hammer home here is that open source can come through many different layers of software. So for instance, here you can see commercial apps. If you're downloading a commercial app, there may be open source software within that app itself. There are many different levels that you really need to be aware of when adopting, whether it's buying an app from someone else, downloading open source code on your own. And each of these should be looked at in a vacuum. It's really hard to look at how the shared security. They really do need to be looked at on an individual basis. The second piece is just the maturity and diversifying the risk across the platform. So different pillars of the organization obviously have different, whether it's it's a platform that's needed to keep, let's say, the website running, probably not wise to use a low maturity open source software. So just diversifying that risk across different layers of the organization will obviously just help your open source policy moving forward. Going back to defining a policy, I think this is, it's very quick to jump in and say, oh, open source is great, let's download it today, without establishing a policy around it. There are a lot of different stakeholders involved in the picture. There are obviously developers who are writing the code, contributing to the code, and they need to fully understand what they can do, what they can't do, and how what they do is going to implicate or accelerate the growth of the company. The legal team will obviously have a certain say in the puzzle. Intellectual property, there are a number of different pieces that the legal team will definitely need to be aligned with. And then the purpose, and this I think is, what is open source going to help us do? What are we trying to achieve? And why does this fit into our overarching goal? And then the fourth one I want to touch on is the community. It's been interesting through my research just understanding how important this community is to the people who contribute and use it. I have a few pieces on here, mentoring, sharing, challenging certain aspects of the code. At the end of the day, people are working on this in their spare time or as part of their job, and they're super passionate about it, but it's fostering that community and understanding what piece do you play within the overarching organization. 2 case studies throughout my research of successful open source kind of strategies. First one I want to touch on, there's a group of car manufacturers that all of you in the room have heard of, BMW, Mercedes, Mazda, Nissan, who have come together and are using this automotive grade Linux in their infotainment. So probably many of the cars that you've driven in is all wired by the same underarching code. It's somewhat interesting. You traditionally think of these car manufacturers as being pretty competitive, and operating against each other. But in this case, they've really come together, and they found, I was thinking about it, I think I'm not going to pick a BMW or Mercedes based on the information system probably. So for them, this is kind of a built-in must-have of cars, and they've had great success with it. They have more and more members joining. And so it's really, as I said, a shared creation of value, much faster fixes, multiple people working on the same project. And the other one I want to showcase is Android. Traditionally, I think kind of seen as I don't believe it's the largest, but it's one of the most prominent open source kind of libraries. 10 million lines of code, which is pretty ridiculous. And 85% of the world's mobile devices are on Android today. And this is, Google's given it out. You can download it tonight if you want to build something sweet. But I think it aligns very closely with Google's business strategy. At the end of the day, they're getting more people on the internet. Those people are going to Google, seeing ads, and the revenue is coming back to them. On the other hand, I think it does further Google's mission. I'm not going to say that's 100% of why they're doing it, but just making the world's information more accessible. So those are kind of the two case studies I looked at. There's a lot more examples of failures and successes, but those were how I kind of grappled with what open source means in an enterprise setting. So I'd love any questions. Ravi, listen.
One question I had is, what degree to which do companies, given that, as you mentioned, a lot of software that companies are using, they didn't create, they're either downloading for free, paying someone for, and a lot of that code makes it, do companies have any grasp on how much is in their organization already?
I don't think so. And this is something I kept coming across is, it's like that huge hexagon, right? It's kind of a black hole. And I think companies have been so excited by the onset of this information and accessible code that they've just been kind of downloading it, and they think about the governance and the policy later. And I think bigger organizations probably less so, just given there's more of a corporate structure in place. But it's kind of scary if you think about them downloading code, using it in whatever their web app, and not really understanding where it came from. Hans.
So you come across that type of area in a company where considering open source is really a must, and or an area or a type of application where it probably wouldn't be wise, and for what reasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I was kind of formulating what I specifically was going to look at, I was looking at different layers of the stack, right? So the server, what employees would use on a day-to-day basis, so like CRM systems, that kind of stuff. I would say that servers are surprisingly largely open source. And it's interesting because if you think about servers, it's like the brains of the web structure. But like Linux and all of these systems are just kind of commonplace these days. I think where there's a harder time in getting people to shift to open source is those higher level CRM systems, kind of everyday tools that the employees are using outside of the IT organization. If that answers your question.
For what reason are those harder? Do you have a sense for that?
So I think there's part of it is like the Microsofts and the closed source systems are doing the job today. And then part of it, I think adoption is also challenging, is getting people who aren't embedded in the IT organization to understand that open source can be powerful. And that may have to do with even shifting that perception even further. Yeah.
So at the beginning you mentioned that even the definition of open source software is controversial, and thinking to Android as an example of open source, I'd imagine that's controversial as well because while it is highly customizable, Google still maintains a lot of control over it.
Yeah.
Have you seen criticism over Android being considered open source, or how exactly that fits into the broader open source software kind of ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to touch on your first point, like when I first started digging into it, I was surprised at like the different definitions of what you would kind of consider, okay, it's either open source or it's not. But there's a lot of stuff about licensing and kind of other intricacies there. But the Android piece is really interesting. There are a lot of people who think it's very kind of self-centered, and that Google basically controls. I'm not sure they necessarily control 85% of the mobile phone market, but in a way they do, right? They could turn it off any point. They could make amendments to that code. So there's a lot of literature out there criticizing Google for making it open source, and that they're just kind of playing to their own pursuits. So yeah, I think it is a concern. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Thanks, guys.